Imagine the moment victory arrived. May 1945. Across Britain, Europe and the Commonwealth, church bells rang out. Soldiers embraced strangers in the streets. The guns finally fell silent. But in warehouses stretching for miles, massive depots and ordnance facilities across the United Kingdom, Africa, India and the Pacific, there was a different kind of silence. A terrifying silence. Stacked in rows that seemed to stretch to the horizon were over 4 million British Lee-Enfield rifles, each one a perfect instrument of war, each one suddenly obsolete. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to 4 million Lee-Enfield rifles after the guns fell silent in 1945? And why, by the 1970s, were some of them selling for just $7 at a place called Western Auto? To understand this mystery, you need to understand the sheer scope of what we're talking about. The Lee-Enfield rifle was the British Empire's weapon of choice. From 1895 onward, it was the gun of the British soldier. It was used in the Boer War, the First World War, and throughout the Second World War. It was manufactured not just in Britain, but in Canada, in Australia, in India. Millions upon millions were produced. At its peak during the Second World War, factories across the Commonwealth were churning out hundreds of thousands every single year. The rifle itself was legendary. Soldiers loved it, officers trusted it. It was accurate, reliable, and iconic. But when the war ended, the British military suddenly had a problem, a catastrophic surplus problem. They didn't need 4 million rifles anymore. They needed to figure out what to do with them. By 1945, the Lee-Enfield had already begun to seem old-fashioned. New semi-automatic rifles were being developed. The military knew that within years, these bolt-action rifles would be completely obsolete. But you can't just make 4 million rifles disappear overnight. These weren't just weapons. They represented an enormous investment, raw materials, manufacturing capacity, decades of production. They were scattered across the globe. Some were in Britain, some were in Egypt, some were in Burma, some were in Australia. Some had been sent to allies who didn't want them back. The British government faced an unprecedented challenge. What do you do with millions of weapons you no longer need, in a world that's suddenly at peace? When peace came in 1945, nobody knew exactly how many Lee-Enfields were sitting in depots worldwide. Military records were chaotic. Some rifles had been captured from other armies. Some had been repaired dozens of times. Some were so damaged they barely functioned. The estimates ranged wildly. But one thing was certain. There were millions of them, and they all had to go somewhere. The immediate aftermath of 1945 was absolute chaos in British military ordnance facilities. In the final weeks of the war, ammunition was being manufactured faster than it could be shipped. Weapons were stockpiled in case of last-minute enemy counterattacks that never came. The moment the surrender was signed, the military stopped moving anything. It was too expensive, too chaotic. Soldiers were being demobilized by the tens of thousands. Officers were heading home. Nobody was thinking about logistics. So the rifles just sat there. In the summer of 1945, British military depots across the world contained an estimated 4 million Lee-Enfields, and absolutely nobody had a plan for them. The first instinct was to keep them. Military planners insisted that you never knew when you might need weapons again. The Cold War was already beginning. The Soviet Union was making troubling moves in Eastern Europe. Maybe, the thinking went, these rifles should be kept as an emergency reserve. But that created a massive practical problem. Where do you store 4 million rifles? How do you prevent rust? How do you prevent theft? How do you prevent them from falling into the wrong hands? The cost of maintaining this stockpile was astronomical, and by 1946 it became clear that the British government simply couldn't afford it. The first major decision came in 1946 and 1947. The British government decided to sell some of the rifles to other nations. This seemed like a perfect solution. You got rid of weapons you didn't need, you made money, and you were helping our allies rebuild after the devastation of war. But here's where it gets complicated. Not every nation wanted Lee-Enfields. Some wanted more modern weapons. Some had their own weapons manufacturing industries. Some were suspicious of British intentions. The sales were slow, very slow. The British government held enormous quantities of rifles that nobody wanted to buy. Then came the decision that would haunt them for decades. The military leadership recommended destroying the weapons. Not all of them, but millions. The argument was simple. Keeping them in storage was too expensive. Selling them was too slow. The rifles were from another era. In a few years, they'd be worth nothing anyway. Better to destroy them now, cut the losses, and move on. And so, starting in 1947, a massive scrapping program began. Imagine the scale of this operation. Rows upon rows of perfect rifles. Rifles that had seen action in Burma, North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. Rifles that had stopped the German army. Rifles that soldiers had died carrying, and they were being systematically destroyed. The destruction happened in multiple ways. Some rifles were disassembled, and the parts were sent to scrap metal dealers. The wood stocks were burned or chipped for fuel. The metal barrels, bolts, and springs were melted down. Rows of machinery crushed the rifles into cubes of twisted metal. In depots across Britain, the sound of destruction became constant. Bang, crash, grind, over and over. Thousands of rifles a day being fed into the machinery. By 1950, millions had been destroyed, but millions remained. The British military simply couldn't destroy them fast enough to keep up with the surplus. This is where the story takes a strange turn. Because even as Britain was destroying millions of perfectly good rifles, other nations were desperately trying to get them. After the war, dozens of countries had been left devastated. Their armies were in ruins. They needed weapons. They couldn't afford new ones. And Britain had a basement full of them. So the British government made a decision. Let's sell them. Cheap, really cheap, to anyone who wants them. Between 1948 and 1965, Britain sold rifles to dozens of nations. The United States bought some, Canada bought some, Pakistan bought some, India bought some. Australia couldn't give them away fast enough. Israel got them, Egypt got them. These rifles, which had fought for the British Empire, suddenly found themselves in the hands of soldiers from every corner of the world. Some were used by Israeli soldiers fighting in the 1948 War of Independence. Some were used by Pakistani soldiers. Some ended up in the hands of insurgents and rebels in every conflict from Burma to Malaya to Kenya. The Lee-Enfield, the weapon of the British soldier, had become the weapon of the post-war world. But here's the thing about selling millions of rifles to other countries. You can't exactly control what happens to them. Some went to governments. Some went to private dealers. Some were lost in shipment. Some were stolen. Some vanished into the underworld of the black market. And some, incredibly, ended up back in Britain, where they were sold as civilian hunting rifles and sporting guns. In America, something remarkable happened. Starting in the early 1950s, British surplus Lee-Enfields began appearing in American gun shops and mail-order catalogues. They came in through multiple channels. Some were sold officially through British government contracts. Some were purchased by American gun dealers directly from Commonwealth nations. And some arrived through more mysterious routes that nobody ever quite figured out. The rifles were cheap, really, really cheap. An American could buy a perfectly functional Lee-Enfield for $5 to $8. For a Depression-era farmer or a rural teenager, this was within reach. You could get a rifle for the price of a hamburger. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, American civilians bought hundreds of thousands of these rifles. They used them for hunting, they used them for target shooting, they used them for plinking. Gun catalogues advertised them as reliable, durable, and cheap. Whole generations of Americans learned to shoot using British rifles made for the British Army. It was a perfect marriage of supply and demand. Britain had too many rifles. America had civilians who wanted cheap ones. And for 20 years, the pipeline hummed along. Then came 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968, passed after the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., fundamentally changed the landscape. Suddenly, importing military rifles became much more difficult. The law didn't ban these rifles outright, but it restricted imports significantly. International military weapons could no longer flow into America like they had before. British military surpluses were suddenly much harder to get into the country. Dealers who had been importing them legally now faced new obstacles. This created an incredible situation for the Lee-Enfield rifles already in America. They became trapped. Shops and distributors who had warehouses full of them couldn't import more to replace stock that sold, and they had to move them fast. This is where Western Auto comes into the story. Western Auto was an American automotive and general merchandise retailer with stores across the country. Some of these stores had sporting goods sections. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, as gun import restrictions tightened and dealers faced the reality that they couldn't import new stock, surplus Lee-Enfields were dumped on the American market at rock-bottom prices. Western Auto catalogues from the early 1970s show Lee-Enfield rifles priced at $6, $7, sometimes $8. These weren't damaged guns, these weren't rejects, these were perfectly functional rifles. A person could walk into a Western Auto store in 1971 and buy a gun that had been carried by British soldiers in World War II for less than the cost of a decent pair of shoes. The rifles came with minimal paperwork. No background checks existed. No waiting periods. Just pay your $7 and walk out with a piece of military history. This phenomenon tells us something remarkable about what happened to millions of Lee-Enfields. They didn't all get destroyed in British depots. Millions made it across the Atlantic. Millions ended up in American hands. Some are still there. Gun collectors today know about this period. They hunt for these rifles. They understand that they're holding a piece of history. A Lee-Enfield rifle, when you find one, often has stories written in its serial numbers. Some have unit markings, some have dates of manufacture, some have names scratched into the wood. Each one can tell you something about where it came from. But not every rifle made it to Western Auto. Not everyone was sold to American civilians. The story of the Lee-Enfields is fragmented into 1,000 different narratives, most of which we'll never fully know. Some rifles were definitely destroyed, as planned, millions of them. The British depots have records of destruction, though those records are often vague and incomplete. But some survived by being sold, some survived by being forgotten, some survived by accident. In 1955, a British officer discovered a warehouse in Burma that had been sealed since 1945. Inside were thousands of Lee-Enfields, perfectly preserved. Nobody had remembered they were there. They'd been sitting in the tropical heat for 10 years, untouched. The discovery created a cascade of new sales. These rifles ended up in India, Pakistan, and eventually some made their way to America. Similar discoveries happened in other locations. A sealed depot in Egypt, a warehouse in Sudan, a storage facility in Malaya. As British military forces withdrew from their far-flung empire, they kept discovering stockpiles of rifles they'd forgotten about. Each discovery meant more sales, more rifles flowing out into the world. Some of these rifles were used in conflicts that came after the war. There's documentary evidence that Lee-Enfields were used by both sides in the Korean War. American soldiers sometimes captured them from Korean soldiers who'd received them through the black market. Some were used in the Malayan emergency by both British troops and the rebels they were fighting. The irony is almost painful. British weapons, sold as surplus, ended up being used against British troops by insurgents. The rifles that had served the British Empire now served the enemies of that empire. In India and Pakistan, millions of Lee-Enfields remained in service for decades after the war. The Indian military actually licensed the design and manufactured their own version called the Ishapur. These weren't just hand-me-downs from Britain. These were rifles that became part of the identity of post-colonial nations. An Indian soldier in 1947 might have been carrying a Lee-Enfield made in Britain in 1943. But his son, in 1967, carried an Ishapur rifle made in India. The design had been adopted and adapted. It had become something new. Some of the strangest survivor stories come from completely unexpected places. There are Lee-Enfields in British museums, obviously. The Imperial War Museum in London has examples. But there are also rifles in small private collections scattered across Europe and America, owned by people who had no idea how significant what they owned actually was. An old rifle hanging above a fireplace in a Scottish cottage. A rifle in a locked case in a gun shop in Montana. A rifle inherited from a grandfather who bought it for $7 in 1971 and never fired it. These rifles are survivors by accident. Nobody went out of their way to preserve them. They simply weren't destroyed. Then there are the rifles that are still being found in surprising places. In 2011, British treasure hunters discovered a Lee-Enfield in a drainage ditch in Yorkshire. It had been there for so long that nobody could say how long. Maybe since 1946. Maybe since 1955. The rifle was in remarkable condition. Once cleaned up, it functioned perfectly. It became a minor news story. People were amazed that after 60-plus years in a ditch, the rifle still worked. This speaks to the quality of the design. These weren't cheap weapons, they were built to last. Another rifle surfaced in Argentina in 2005. Nobody knows how it got there. Some historians speculated it might have come from a soldier who immigrated after the war. Others thought it might have been purchased through some complex black market transaction. The rifle's serial number suggested it was manufactured in 1943 during the height of the war effort. It had travelled further than most of its kind. It had crossed oceans and continents. It had ended up on the other side of the world, held by people who had no connection to the British military. The really mysterious aspect of this story is that we don't actually know what happened to millions of these rifles. British military records are incomplete. Export documentation is fragmented. Some nations never admitted how many weapons they received. Private dealers left no detailed records. And once rifles entered the American civilian market, tracking them became nearly impossible. A rifle sold for $7 in 1971 could have gone anywhere. It could have been buried, lost, stolen, used in a crime and destroyed, sold again and again until nobody could trace its history. The trail simply goes cold. What we do know is that somewhere between 2 and 3 million Lee-Enfields were definitely destroyed in the post-war scrapping program. British military records confirm this. The machinery ran continuously for years. Entire trainloads of rifles were sent to scrap facilities. The metal was recycled into everything from new weapons to civilian machinery. The wood became fuel. Nothing was wasted. It was efficient and systematic, and it was, in a way, a tragedy. These were weapons that had served with honour. They were being reduced to their constituent materials. But probably 2 to 3 million survived, some in foreign armies, some in private collections, some in gun shops, some scattered across time and geography in ways we can never fully reconstruct. The Lee-Enfield didn't disappear. It dispersed. It fragmented into countless individual stories, most of which will never be written down. Today, Lee-Enfield rifles are experiencing a renaissance among gun collectors. They've become valuable again. A Lee-Enfield in good condition can sell for $300 to $500. That $7 rifle from 1971 is now worth 50 times that. Collectors track down these rifles. They restore them. They research their histories. They try to figure out where each rifle came from, what unit it served with, what hands held it during the war. Every serial number is a clue. Every marking is a piece of a puzzle. Some of the rifles ending up in museums are the ones with the most interesting histories. A rifle that was actually used in Burma. A rifle that was captured by the Japanese and recovered. A rifle that somehow made its way to the American West and was used by a rancher for 50 years. These stories matter because they're individual. They're human. They take the massive historical event of surplus weapons disposal and reduce it to something intimate and specific. The Lee-Enfield story also tells us something important about the post-war world. Britain emerged from the war economically exhausted. They needed the money from weapons sales. Countries like India, Pakistan, and Egypt needed weapons to build their post-colonial armies. America needed cheap rifles for civilians. In a way, the dispersal of Lee-Enfields across the world was inevitable. You couldn't have stopped it. The forces that moved these weapons were economic necessity, military need, and simple market demand. A British government couldn't afford to destroy weapons they could sell. A weapons dealer couldn't afford to leave money on the table by not importing them to America. An American civilian couldn't afford not to buy a gun for $7. What happened to 4 million Lee-Enfield rifles is a story with multiple endings. Millions were destroyed, melted down, and ceased to exist. Millions were sold to nations and ended up in foreign armies. Some were sold to civilians in America and scattered across a continent. Some were lost or stolen or forgotten. And some, incredibly, are still out there, still functional, still loaded with history. A person today can pick up a Lee-Enfield that was manufactured in Birmingham in 1943 and was possibly carried by a British soldier at Normandy and was then sold to America and has been sitting in an attic for 50 years. That person is holding a direct connection to the Second World War, a physical link to one of the most catastrophic events in human history. The rifles that sold for $7 at Western Auto were the lucky ones. They weren't destroyed. They weren't lost. They weren't used in conflicts they weren't meant for. They simply persisted. They survived the post-war chaos through accident and luck and the simple power of supply and demand. They remind us that sometimes the most remarkable historical artifacts are the ones we almost overlooked. The ones that were so common, so cheap, so readily available, that we couldn't imagine they mattered. And then decades later, we look back and understand that they mattered very much indeed.